The talk I'm going to give today is not a standard scientific talk in that it's more of like a meta science talk about how we should do neuroscience. And also it doesn't have results. It's just a plan. It's an idea that I hope kind of starts conversation. Right. So well, let's see if this is going to work. There we go. Okay. So the outline, it's going to be organized a little bit more around questions rather than answers. So I want to talk about what kind of understanding neuroscientists want when they try to study the brain, right? When they apply, methods to analyze neural data, what do they want? And to talk about that, I'm going to walk through first an example study from neuroscience that I think is kind of representative of what people in what we would maybe call systems neuroscience do to try to understand the brain. And then there's going to be a sub question that comes up about if control is related to understanding and thinking about that. And then I'm going to talk about this plan, which is that we should test the tools of neuroscience on artificial neural networks. That's going to be, spoiler alert, that's the main plan. And to kind of walk through that, we have to ask some questions about what has to be true about two different systems in order to study them the same way, in order to apply the same tools to them. And then I'm going to talk about this idea of neural systems understanding as a unified field, which should connect neuroscience and interpretable AI. So that's the very explicit neuro AI connection. And then we can talk about kind of what this would look like in the future if everything went really well according to this plan. Right, so to start, in example study in neuroscience, I chose this study from 2014 just because it really cleanly demonstrates themes that I think appear all over, systems neuroscience, experimental neuroscience, computational neuroscience. So this is a paper looking at trying to study the neural dynamics of reaching in monkey motor cortex. So again, the actual specifics of the science aren't that relevant, but I just want to highlight kind of the approach that they take and what they get out of it to keep in mind as we think about how neuroscientists use the tools of analysis that they have. So in this study, they're trying to study the idea of preparatory activity in the motor cortex. So this was an established idea that the motor cortex kind of has patterns in it that represent an upcoming movement, and people have studied the nature of this preparatory activity. And they're doing so by recording neurons from motor cortex during non-delayed and delayed reaches, and on some trials, the target location switches. So what that looks like is that the monkeys are given a target that they need to reach to. So it's the center out reaching test. They start with the arm in the center, and they're going to have to reach to different targets. They're told that target. And then when after that target comes on, there's a delay period that could be as little as 0 milliseconds, meaning that there's no delay, up to 900 milliseconds. And after that, there would be a go cue that means, okay, go reach to the target, right? Sorry, I am like mispointing. But on some trials, instead of the go cue coming on after the first target, a second target comes on instead. So they might be told initially, oh, you're going to reach to this point, and then instead of a go cue saying, okay, go to that point, the target switches to a different location. And then there's another delay between 0 and 900 milliseconds, and then they go to that second location. So this study was set up to study both the nature of the preparatory period, when there's a delay or not a delay, between knowing where you need to reach and actually reaching, and also to see what happens if your target has to switch during that process. So that's what it was set up to study. And then they did the things that people normally do. So for example, as I said, they were recording from motor cortex. And so they looked at the PSTHs, they looked at the averaged activity around important points in the trial structure. So when the first target is on, in cases where there's a switch, when the switch happens, when the go cue comes on, when the movement actually begins. The different colors here are just different reach targets. So this is very standard systems neuroscience, right? You record a bunch of individual neurons, you look at their average activity over time, and try to make sense of what's going on here, right? We can see very clear dynamical signatures of things like switch and target location, right? And then they also look at, the population activity. So this is another very common thing that systems neuroscientists do now. You take your full population of neurons that were recorded simultaneously, and you do dimensionality reduction, and you look at the activity in this lower dimensional space. So they're looking at this three-dimensional space, and they're seeing that, so for the case where there's no switch, then you just have baseline activity. You go to the preparatory state for the first target. You're told you can move, and then you move. So that preparatory state is where you hang out during the delay period before you're told you can move. If there is a switch, then they see if there's a switch and a delay, it goes to a second preparatory, the first preparatory state hangs out, goes to the next preparatory state for the next target, and then moves. This right here is kind of their main finding, which is that if there's no delay after you get told that you have to switch your target, you can skip that second preparatory state, right? This is their main finding. So this is what they wanted to understand. You go to your first preparatory state, you're waiting for your go cue. Instead, you're told that you have to go to a different target and you have to go right now, and you just skip that preparatory state. And so this was important because it updated our understanding of the nature of preparatory states and whether they're required. So in this paper, they say, okay, now we have an updated model of motor cortical dynamics, right? They did this experiment, they performed analysis on the neural data, and they came up with an updated account of the simple story that had already existed in the field. There was the story that you need to go to the preparatory state, and the initial conditions that that preparatory state sets controls the dynamical system, and that controls where you reach. But now they're saying, hey, look, you can get a reach to the target without having gone through that exact preparatory state, right? You don't need to go to those exact initial dynamics. So the outcome of their all of this analysis, all of this, recording, training the monkey, doing the analysis on the neural activity is this updated conceptual model, this kind of simple conceptual model that now can be the thing that we use to have a mental representation of how this system works, right? And again, this is all kind of representative, I think, of a lot of papers in systems neuroscience. Now, the conceptual model has some caveats and some assumptions in it. So for example, they noticed that even if you get the go cue and the target at the same time, you get kind of a little bit of movement in some direction before you actually start doing the actual movement of the arm. Like the neural activity kind of moves before it seems to actually implement the go cue. And so they're saying that target information is transmitted more quickly to the motor cortex than the go cue. That's just an assumption they have to make for their simple model to work. They're also saying whatever system is sending the go cue could be monitoring the preparatory state for motor cortex and sends the go cue later when motor cortex is in the right state to receive it. So these are kind of things that they can't directly address with the data that they have. They're just kind of saying, well, we only recorded from motor cortex, and so we have to make some assumptions about what is going into motor cortex to explain the results that we have, right? So again, all of this I think is very standard for what happens in systems neuroscience when you're trying to come up with an understanding of how a system works. So that leads us to the question, are the tools of systems neuroscience helping us understand the brain? Is this type of analysis where we record neural activity, you do dimensionality reduction, you look at the way the lines move over time, and then you come up with a model of how the brain works. And note, in this study, there were no perturbations. This was an observation-based study in the sense that there was recording of neural activity during a task, but there was no explicit manipulation of neural activity. And so to think about whether this approach helps us understand the brain, as I said, we need to ask what kind of understanding do we seek, right? And I would say that this, in this example paper, this output of the new conceptual model is what a lot of times what people are seeking when they're doing systems neuroscience. And I would say that that can be described as something on the algorithmic level according to Mars levels. So in Mars levels, when you're studying a neural system, you have the computation level, which is like, what is the system doing? Why does it exist? And in motor control, the motor system exists to control the body's movements. And then you have the algorithmic level, which is what are the steps that it takes in order to do that kind of control? And then the implementation level is like, what neurons are doing it, where, kind of more into the physical nature of the system. And so I would say that a lot of times neuroscientists are looking for a description on the algorithmic level. They want to know kind of that middle set of steps that explains how the system is able to achieve what it needs to achieve, right? And we can say that what an algorithmic understanding is, because even in the Mars framework, it's still kind of vague as to what really counts as an algorithmic understanding. I would say that it's a simplified story that offers some predictive ability, but will be lossy, right? Like the little conceptual model isn't going to explain every wiggle in the neural data. It's a conceptual model that gives you the broad sense of like, the activity is going to go here, it's going to wait, then it's going to go there. This is what's going to happen in broad strokes, right? But it has predictive power. It's not so abstract and vague that you can't make any kind of counterintuitive predictions out of it. You can still predict something from it, but not down to like the most detailed level. So it must be productive and accurate though. Those predictions should be correct and you should be able to make them. You should be able to move the field forward when you have this algorithmic understanding of how the system works, right? So if that's what we are seeking, it would be good if we had a way to know if we're getting that, right? If we're making progress on getting this kind of understanding. And so that's where the plan comes in, that we should operationalize this kind of understanding in terms of it being experimentally validated understanding. So if the idea is that our analysis methods take us from some complex neural system, we apply some sort of analysis, and we get this simplified understanding of the system, right? We've taken something that's complex and messy, and we've simplified it in a way that hopefully captures all the important parts and lets us think through what would happen in counterfactual scenarios. So we get a simplified understanding. As I said, a lot of times that's where things stop in a neuroscience paper. But then what we need to do is then actually do some sort of perturbation on the system to verify that this simplified understanding that we got was correct, right? So this is what I would call experimentally validated understanding. It's a simple idea. You actually just have to follow up with the hypotheses that you would get from your simplified algorithmic understanding and see if that's how the system works. And so obviously this does sometimes happen in neuroscience, but it's much harder to do that in neuroscience, right? But here, as you can see, the method of success here to say that you actually understand the system is that you have to demonstrate control over the behavior of the system. If I think that I understand how motor cortex works and I do a perturbation based on that understanding, I should be able to change the movement of the animal. I should be able to control how the animal moves its arm, because that's how I demonstrate that I actually have an accurate understanding of how the system works, right? And if you can't do that, something went wrong somewhere. So this is, equating, not completely equating, but saying that control is a way to demonstrate understanding. And this, people argue about this. People within neuroscience would argue about that. People, with a more philosophical bent would argue about this. But I think in this case, there's a lot of reasons to say that control really is a good way to test if we truly understand the system. So one is just that a lot of neuroscience is inherently about connecting neural activity to behavior. We want to understand why animals and humans display certain patterns of accuracy in tasks or ability or even biases, suboptimal performance. We want to explain all of that based on what's happening in the brain. And so it is about this connection between the neural system and the behavior. And so if you can modulate the neural system to modulate the behavior, that does suggest that you're making progress on the core question of neuroscience, which is how the neural activity relates to behavior. And in the Mars framework, it very explicitly connects the algorithmic level to the computational level. The whole point of the algorithmic description is that it describes how you are able to take certain steps to achieve the computational goal. If you are modulating those steps and you're not changing anything about what the system is capable of or what it does, then you haven't found the algorithm that explains the computational goal of the system, that explains its output, right? And so I think, for those reasons, it makes sense that control needs to be important for demonstrating understanding. I think one of the major objections to the idea is that sometimes you can get control without understanding, right? So like if you have understanding, you should be able to control a system, but you can possibly control a system without that sense of understanding, just by using like some giant trained network that modulates the brain and somehow changes behavior, but you don't know why. And I think in the kind of structure that I said, which is you have this middle step of this simplified algorithmic understanding that you then use to do your behavioral predictions and control, that constrains the types of ways of doing control, right? You have to have some part in the middle where you're using a much more simplified model of the system to come up with the hypotheses about how you could control the system. So that kind of puts some constraints on what you can use to control the system. It has to be some sort of simplified description in this framework. Right, so as I said, in practice, experimentally validating a model like this is very difficult in neuroscience, right? Even if you have a sense of this is how the system works, and I can make a prediction about an experiment. If I modulated these neurons this way, this is how the output would change. You can have all of that, but you might not have the experimental tools to do the exact modulation you need. Like I need to change the strength of these neurons at this time. I need to shut off this neuron for 10 milliseconds in this window or something like that. It's hard to do that. Obviously, we're getting more and more tools to do that kind of stuff, but it still remains very difficult to actually do the modulation experiments you want in the brain. We don't have that kind of access, right? And so I would argue that we should do this whole system where we try and use a method to come up with a simplified understanding and test it on a network, and then that tells us how good that method is. We should do this whole system in artificial neural networks, right? So take a method from neuroscience, apply it to artificial neural networks, and see how often it gives you this kind of understanding, right? So we apply our methods, we see if we can get a simplified understanding, we use that to modulate the activity of an artificial neural network where we can do that kind of modulation, right? So then the question becomes, are the tools of systems neuroscience helping us understand the brain? We can change that question slightly to, do they help us understand artificial neural networks? And this becomes a much more tractable problem because of the ease of experimental access in artificial neural networks. But then that gets to a question of what has to be true about two systems in order to be able to apply a given analysis method to both, right? I'm saying that we can kind of swap out the brain with artificial neural networks, and we can use that as a acceptable test of our systems, or sorry, a test of our tools that we want to apply to the brain, right? And so that I'm saying that the same tools can be applied to these two systems, right? And what has to be true about those two systems for this to all hold, right? And you know, as someone who works in neuroscience and neuro AI and uses artificial neural networks to study the brain and make models of the brain in many different capacities, it's becoming less hard to say this, but people really get into the weeds about this relationship, right? People have a lot of thoughts about this relationship. They have a lot of concerns about people overstating the relationship between artificial neural networks and the brain. And so I want to really lay out, for the purposes of this idea of testing our tools on artificial neural networks, what has to be true about that relationship and what doesn't have to be true about that relationship. So to apply the same analysis method to both, they both have to conform to the formal requirements of the method. So if you're applying an analysis, there will be things that need to be true about your data for that analysis to be valid, right? If you're applying something that looks at temporal dynamics, you need to have temporal dynamics, right? And not all artificial neural networks have temporal dynamics. Certainly, if you're looking at like spike timing, it's going to be hard to do that in artificial neural networks. But you know, there are other things that are assumed about the structure of data when you apply an analysis method to that data. And so obviously, both systems have to have to meet those formal requirements, right? But they don't need to function in the same way. So artificial neural networks and the brain do not need to be perfect matches to each other for us to be able to apply the same analysis methods to both of them. And we see this already within neuroscience. You can take tools from neuroscience, something like representational similarity analysis or graph neuroscience methods and all of that. And you can see examples in the literature where we apply the same thing to humans and monkeys. And that doesn't mean that we think humans and monkeys are the same thing. In fact, we usually use that. We will apply the same method to two different species or two different individuals in order to ask the question, do these systems process information the same way? And the answer can be no. So you don't need to have a perfect match between two systems in order to be able to analyze them with the same methods, right? And we can see this within neuroscience. There are methods that have been applied to C. elegans and humans, and people usually don't complain about that. People don't say, hey, wait a second, humans and C. elegans are different, therefore you can't study their neural activity in low-dimensional PC space the same way. But sometimes when this happens, when I try to say that we can apply methods to ANNs and that can tell us something about how we study the brain, then people say, no, 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 they're two different. But no, an analysis tool can be applied to many different systems, and that can be perfectly valid, and that's okay. And those systems don't have to work the exact same way for that same analysis tool to be useful in all of those systems, right? And I would say that artificial neural networks and brains are similar in certain ways that are important for how we think about understanding them. So some similarities that are relevant here are that brains and artificial neural networks are both hierarchical, high dimensional, nonlinear, modular, sometimes recurrent in ANNs, definitely recurrent in the brain, task optimized either through actual training or evolution or development. They have parallel processing, distributed information processing systems, right? So these are all things that are true about both the brain and ANNs. And I would argue that these are the things that make them hard to study, right? In the brain, we have information distributed across all different brain areas. It's got, you're looking at different regions in a hierarchy. You don't know what area is doing what. All of the nonlinearities really make it a lot harder. And you're trying to understand how all that stuff is used to actually make a system that processes information and was somehow designed to do that kind of information processing, right? So this makes both of these systems hard to understand and hard for us to develop methods that will pull out the relevant parts for our understanding. So they're both hard to study, right? So it's like, well, why use ANNs? And as I said, the artificial neural networks have the experimental benefit, right? Because you can observe, record all neural activity and connectivity under whatever conditions you want, right? And the ANN's not going to get tired. It's not going to stop being motivated by juice. You can get any stimulus condition you want, and you get all of the neural activity in the whole network and all of the connectivity in the whole network, right? So that's beautiful. Neuroscientists would love to have that. And then for the purposes of testing our understanding, as I said, it's hard to do modulation experiments in real brains, but you can do, again, any kind of precise and large-scale perturbation you want. You can say how you want every single neuron in the network to be perturbed at any point in time during the experiment. And you can even do kind of developmental interventions. You can change the training diet that the network sees or the algorithm that's used to train it and see how that impacts things, right? So you have complete control over the system in terms of building it, in terms of analyzing it and recording from it, and in terms of perturbing it, right? And these things are particularly important for what I'm talking about because, as I said in that example paper, sometimes you come up with your conceptual model and there's aspects of it that you don't understand and you appeal to some unknown factor. The brain region that sends information to this brain region does something and that explains the data that I can't explain on my own right now, right? You don't get that escape if you are capable of recording every neuron in the whole artificial neural network, right? If there's some other area that's sending information in, you have to find that area or you're wrong. That's not what's happening, right? So the complete observability is really important for really testing our understanding and our claims about how these systems work, because there's no escape routes. There's no way out of explaining something that you can't explain in the data that you have. And then, yeah, the perturbability is obviously important for doing this kind of verified understanding. So did my understanding of the system actually lead to a prediction that was accurate? Well, you can actually test it. And then another benefit, as I see it, is that we don't know how artificial neural networks work. And you might think, well, how is that a benefit? Don't you want to prove that we can understand how these systems work? But I would say that it is a benefit because it's an honest test of what we're trying to get our tools to do. A big part of what's hard in neuroscience is that we don't actually know what we're looking for, right? Like we don't know the shape of the answer sometimes for how the brain does certain things. We don't know what to expect to find in our data when we're looking for this algorithmic level understanding. And we're in the same situation with ANNs. They can be learning all sorts of weird ways to solve problems that we can't come up with in advance, right? And so being in that same position of lacking a pre-understanding of what we're looking for is a better test of how we're trying to proceed in neuroscience and what tools would help us. And so, because a lot of times in neuroscience, in any field, people develop a method. In this case, it's like, oh, I want a method that can help identify sequences in neural activity. And so you develop the method to do that, and then you develop synthetic data that has the stuff you're looking for, and then you show, look, my method can recover what I was looking for. And that makes sense if you're looking for something that's that specific. But if your question is, what is the algorithm that these brain regions are implementing, it's unlikely that you know exactly what that looks like in the data, like what the signature of that is in the data, and therefore you don't know how to pull it out with the method, and you don't know how to verify that your method did pull it out correctly, right? But as I said, if we accept that about ANNs and we come in with that attitude to ANNs that we don't know what we're looking for, then progress in understanding ANNs is more similar to progress in understanding the brain, because it requires actually coming up with the concepts of what we're trying to look for, not just recovering things that we know that we put in there, right? So it's more honest, I would say, to apply this to ANNs rather than trying to test our tools on a system where we know the answer that we're trying to get out. Okay, so how do you actually vet a tool in this framework, right? I'm saying we can use artificial neural networks to test our tools, but what does that maybe more specifically look like? So first, you apply the tool to a trained neural network. You have a neural network, you have some question about it, you take some method from neuroscience and you apply it to the neural network to try to understand it. Then you do that step of, does it provide experimentally validated understanding? So you apply the method, you get some sort of algorithmic level insight about how your system works after you've applied the method, and then you come up with an experiment based on that understanding, and then you test that experiment. You kind of close that loop. Did it actually work? And then you repeat this across many networks, right? Because we want to know the general ability of a tool to give us algorithmic understanding so that we can tell neuroscientists, hey, this tool worked really well when I was studying networks that did this kind of thing or had this kind of architecture. It didn't give me interpretable results when I studied a different kind of network. So what this could look like, so let's say you have a network, like a convolutional neural network. It can process images. In this case, these are images just of different digits, but they have different types of noise applied to them. And maybe you want to understand, how does this network, how is it able to classify these images even in the presence of noise, right? What is it doing? And so the method that we're going to test is demixed PCA. So this is a dimensionality reduction method that is supposed to be able to give you demixed dimensions for your data, which means like this dimension represents one aspect of the task and this dimension represents a different aspect of the task. And so it makes more interpretable dimensions for understanding your data in. So let's say that you apply demixed PCA to this network, and one possible outcome is that the DPCA does find neatly separated dimensions. Maybe you find one dimension of activity where the noise is encoded, like the presence and type of noise is encoded. And it's like, okay, this activity direction and activity space represents the noise, and this one represents the actual digit that's in the image, right? Then demixed PCA did its job, it found separable dimensions. Another possibility is that DPCA just does nothing. Like you get it out and your dimensions are all mixed up, and it didn't work in this case, right? And so usually, if you're actually studying neural data, you get that and you're like, can't use DPCA, and you move on to the next method, right? But in this case, we're trying to keep track of how well demixed PCA works. And so even that kind of null outcome is still an outcome for the testing of this tool. But let's say you do get the outcome where you can demix your activity, then that presents a natural experiment. So if one dimension is related to noise and the other dimensions are related to signal, then you would expect that if you boost the activity along the signal dimensions and reduce it along the noise dimensions, you should make the performance of the network go up, right? So you could do that experiment, and it could be DPCA found a great demix setting, but when I actually manipulated activity according to those dimensions, I didn't change performance the way that I thought I would. I wasn't able to control the behavior of the network, even though DPCA gave me demixed PCs. Or it could be, it worked. You got demixed PCs, you modulated according to them, and you made the performance of the network go up, right? So in this case, this would tell us that demixed PCA is a useful tool. It is helping us make progress on understanding how this kind of network does its computations, right? This would be a point in favor of DPCA, right? And so if you do this again over many different network architectures doing different kind of tasks, you might observe some patterns where certain methods are good at certain types of understanding and certain types of networks doing certain tasks, and other methods have their area where they're best. But the idea is that you would get a complete and accurate description of how well a method does, right? So the goal here isn't actually to figure out how this network classifies noisy digits, right? The goal is to reflect on how well each method let us understand how this network classified noisy digits. And what this does is that it actually gets around what I would call the file drawer problem for methods. So we know about the file drawer problem for experimental results, which is just like you did an experiment, you got kind of a null result and you didn't publish it. And so nobody knows that that manipulation doesn't affect whatever outcome you were studying. Like it's hidden from the literature, and that's bad because then the literature is biased towards positive results and people don't know about all the times you tried something and it didn't work, right? So I think it's kind of established that that's not good for the actual empirical literature. But we also have this for methods. As I said, if you were studying neural data and you applied DPCA and it didn't work, you wouldn't publish that. You probably wouldn't say, I tried DPCA and it didn't help me understand the system. You just wouldn't comment on it. And you would keep trying different analysis methods until you found something that gave you a nice story that you could tell in your paper, right? But that means we don't know all the times that a method fails to give us any kind of understanding, right? And it might be nice to know that, hey, there was this method that people were really excited about. I don't see a lot of papers that used it. I don't know why. If we actually could report, oh, well, a bunch of people tried it and it didn't work, then that would help other people in the future, not waste their time on it. So being more explicit and open about when a method actually helps would help progress in the field. And then so we can ask, like, which methods am I actually talking about in systems neuroscience? So this is from a paper that I have, which just kind of, in my mind, describes like the toolbox of systems neuroscience. So the idea is that there are certain tools that are used widely across systems neuroscience. They're not super dependent on like the question or the brain region or the task or anything like that. They're fairly generic tools that can be applied usually as maybe like a first step description of your data, that kind of thing. So we talked about dimensionality reduction, latent factor modeling, representational similarity analysis, similarly representational geometry, network-based analyses, encoding models, and then sometimes they're all really specific analysis methods that are designed for specific data. But I would say this is kind of, this is what a lot of people would think of as first pass, how can I approach my data kind of stuff that's not super specific to any system. But as I hinted to at the beginning of this talk, we're not the only people who want to understand neural systems, right? Neural networks. There's a whole field of interpretable AI people who are also trying to understand these systems. And so they have their own toolbox of methods that in some ways interact with ours, are related to what neuroscientists do, but are also a bit different. And so we can think about their methods as well. What are people who study artificial neural networks full time, what are they doing to try to understand their system? And so this is their toolbox that I came up with David Bao, who's an interpretability researcher at Northeastern. And so they have things like input synthesis methods, attribution methods, representation probing, causal mediation analysis, dissection methods, influence methods, and surrogate modeling. So it's slightly different toolbox. And as I said, some of these are overlapping. Some of them are not things that we could do in the brain due to limitations, but they might be giving us inspiration for the types of things we need to be looking for in the brain, right? So the basic idea is that right now, we have all of neuroscience that's trying to understand the brain in many different ways. There's interpretable AI that's using their own approaches. They're kind of overlapping. Like there's definitely people who are aware of methods in neuroscience who applied them to AI. There's like people who come from neuroscience who do interpretability. So there's some overlap. I would say that we just need to like do it more, have more overlap, to develop some sort of unified set of concepts and tools and frameworks that I would call like neural systems understanding in general, right? Like we are facing similar problems and we're kind of talking to each other, and it's like more and more these fields are talking to each other, but it would be cool if they talk to each other even more. Yeah, So I would say that we should be pushing these fields more together. Certainly, as I'm showing here, like there's still plenty of neuroscience that wouldn't fall into this kind of overlapping area where the questions are really similar and the methods should be really similar. There's still like plenty of things that neuroscientists have to do that are really, really brain specific. And there's stuff that interpretable AI is doing that isn't really what we need, but there should be more overlap. And so what would this kind of a development of this kind of field require? So it relies on the belief that there can be common tools. As I said, these systems, they don't have to function identically. The ANNs don't have to be a replica of the brain in order for there to be tools that we can both use in common to make progress on our respective problems. And so this would include validating methods from neuroscientists and from neuroscience and interpretable AI. So I've been talking about this, like, taking methods from neuroscience and testing them on artificial neural networks. In interpretable AI, sometimes the methods are tested explicitly to see if they lead to control of the system, but not always. Sometimes in interpretable AI, there's been kind of fights amongst people that like that method made it feel like you understood the system, but it didn't actually help you understand the system. Like you couldn't actually use that method to make changes to the system that were predictable from your understanding. So not all of the methods in interpretable AI, by definition, actually do this kind of loop of validating that they can lead to control. So both fields have methods that would need to be tested to see if they're actually making progress. And if we're going to be kind of merging methods, as I said, there are things that people in interpretable AI do that we can't do in the brain, like take gradients through all of the weights, right? And so obviously we don't want interpretable AI people to be constrained to what neuroscientists can do. They should still go explore whatever methods that are possible for them. But if they stumble on something that seems really useful, we might want to find a way to kind of retrofit it so that we could do it somehow in the brain. So coming up with like approximations to things that people in interpretable AI do, if it turns out that those things were really helpful for them making progress in understanding their systems. And we see this already a little bit in, there's something called sparse autoencoders that people in AI are using a lot, and it kind of goes against the dogma of neuroscience, which is that you want to do dimensionality reduction on your neural data. Sparse autoencoders are kind of a form of dimensionality expansion that you would use to understand your neural data. And so it's possible that neuroscience should take that kind of conceptual inspiration and see what we can do with it, even if we can't collect the data needed to train these sparse autoencoders because they require exposure, like they require recording the activity of the population in response to a lot of stimuli. And then hopefully this would help us build better methods for where existing ones fail. Because if you have a more clear map of like, this tool did not help me under these circumstances, then maybe you can understand why, and you can work to make those tools better in the areas where they're failing. But the point of kind of unifying these things is that you can identify these themes and concepts and vocabularies that help us with this big problem of understanding these big distributed hierarchical systems, right? As I said, these systems are hard to understand for similar reasons. And I think that there needs to be kind of new concepts that come out of trying to understand them in this explicit way. Now, the development of this field does not require certain things, right? So it does not, as I said, require any specific claims about artificial neural networks as models of the brain, right? Just that they can be studied with similar tools. It does not assume that all neural systems should be submitted to the same tools. There will be reasons why you would use one method for one problem and different methods for other problems. The idea is just to scope out that space of what problems are best suited for analysis with which methods. And it does not mean that all questions in neuroscience and AI can be solved with methods that are useful for both, right? As I said, those bubbles are not completely overlapping. There's a region where they do, but these fields will continue to have their own problems that are separate from each other. But I do think that by trying to push these fields together and have more explicit interaction, there could be a synergistic effect between putting kind of all of these people in a room together. So you benefit from more diverse disciplinary backgrounds working on the same problem. You could get people who come from like a computer programming background, who view interpretability as like, well, this is a problem because I can't debug my system because I don't know how it works, right? That's one take on why you want to understand neural systems. And then you get the neuroscience perspective, which brings a lot of like longer history to it and ideas about thinking about the brain from different, more biology-based perspectives. And you get access to more diverse examples, like more model organisms, right? And sometimes that's really important because you have like an assumption about how neural systems must work or what algorithms they must be implementing. And then you find some weird animal that's clearly doing something totally out of the box that you didn't expect. And it changes your sense of what's possible. And we get that with AI. AI is this weird alien intelligence. And we can say, oh my God, that's how it's solving that problem. I never would have thought of that, right? And it works both ways though, because biology finds really weird solutions as well. So just expanding our set of neural systems that we study might lead us to those weird edge cases that actually end up kind of breaking open a lot of new thought in different areas. And as I said, neuroscience benefits from being able to rapidly study artificial neural networks, rapidly build different types of artificial neural networks to study. AI could benefit from thinking more about embodied and evolved neural systems, which again are like an alien intelligence to them because they're used to studying these big just systems that are trained end to end for the most part. So I think it benefits both fields. If I'm being honest, I think neuroscience needs it more. I think we're the ones that are a lot more constrained in our methods, and so opening the door to a world of much bigger manipulations, much bigger kind of scale experiments could lead to some breakthroughs in how we think about the brain. So what would be kind of a successful takeaway from trying to do this? What would be like a good language that we could develop by trying to study neural systems that will help us understand them in this like kind of algorithmic way? So as I said, the point of the simplified algorithmic understanding is that it lets you take the big complex system and represent it in this much smaller, simpler way. So it requires that you're compressing something about the big model into a simpler form, into like concepts that we're used to understanding. And it's important to realize that what is a familiar simplified concept can change and grow. So even within systems neuroscience, the idea of plotting activity in low dimensional space, in like principal component space, that's something that it took a while, at least as I viewed it, for neuroscientists to be comfortable with and feel like they understood what that meant, right? You had your big population. For a long time, people were analyzing these neurons individually. They were like classifying them as these are like the quick responding neurons and these are the ramping neurons, and that's how people thought about it. And then we said, hey, let's actually do like a formal method of dimensionality reduction and look at the activity in that space. And that took time for people to accept that as a way of looking at neural data and a way of understanding neural data. So we need that kind of thing, I think, but like way more because PC principal components just give you like a linear projection of your data, but the concepts that are going to actually be useful for understanding complex neural systems are going to be like probably weird nonlinear objects that we need to all become familiar with understanding at some point. But so that's again where the kind of interdisciplinary nature comes in. Like people bring ideas from different fields of mathematics and computer science and say, hey, this is an abstraction we use all the time. It might help you understand the brain. And then neuroscientists, if it is useful, neuroscientists can figure out how to understand that particular abstraction. Relatedly, like the units of these algorithms are still to be identified. What these concepts are, what these abstractions are that will then be able to speak about them in some abstract algorithmic space. I think for the most part, we don't know those things. We don't know how to take a raw population of neural activity and extract like the one unit that represents this thing and the other unit that represents that thing, and how do these things relate to each other to implement an algorithm. There are methods that people are developing to do kind of this exact thing, like how do you do dimensionality reduction on a whole dynamical system that gives you an algorithmic type thing. And the extent to which that will be like one method that can be applied to everything versus something that's going to need to be specific to each kind of question, that's something that still needs to be determined. So now it's important as a caveat to note that some people will argue that an algorithmic-like understanding of artificial neural networks is simply not possible, right? Like there are these big distributed systems that we've trained, and that's it. That's the understanding. You know all the matrix multiplications, you know the data they were trained on, you know the algorithm that was used to train them, and don't ask any more questions because you're not going to find any more answers. And if that's true, that would apply to neuroscience as well, presumably, right? It's a big system that was evolved. It does all this kind of stuff. Like, what really are you expecting to understand about it more than that, right? And I mean, this is something to keep in mind. Like, what do we consider understanding? If your understanding needs to be, I understand what every neuron is doing at every point in time, I think you will fail at that. I think you can't have that as the expectation. So we do need to think about, again, what are we even looking for in these models? What do we expect to get out of models that explain the brain, right? But this idea that like there's nothing to be done does suggest that activity and connectivity cannot be compressed. Basically, there's nothing simpler that we can say about a neural network other than its entire set of weights and activity, right? And that just seems unlikely. Like, I think we have reasons to believe that there are ways to kind of compress what the activity and weights are doing in a way that leads to this more algorithmic level understanding that isn't so specific to all the details. Okay, so to summarize, neuroscience and triple AI both aim to make sense of how neural systems create behavior. So I think that they should be more together, and we should be using artificial neural networks to test the methods that we use in neuroscience because they offer this rapid and ideal experimental environment. But to really end up making progress on the kind of very thorny questions that face us in both of these fields, we're going to need to come up with like new concepts of how we understand distributed neural activity. And if you want to see more of those like tables and other things, I have this paper with David Bao that talks about this whole plan. And also, I am looking for PhD students and a postdoc this year. Thank you.